April 14, 1944. Dawn had barely broken over the dense, mist-choked forests of eastern France. The air smelled of damp earth and gunpowder, and every rustle of leaves set nerves on edge. Somewhere in the distance, the low, metallic roar of enemy tanks broke the fragile morning calm. In the trenches, soldiers clutched rifles like lifelines, their knuckles white, hearts hammering against rib cages that felt far too fragile for the day's coming storm. 17-year-old Hans Meyer adjusted the strap of his helmet, the cold steel biting against his forehead. He was barely old enough to shave, yet here he was, stationed at a machine gun nest at the far right flank of a defensive line that had already taken a beating. Around him, the men whispered grimly about reports of collapsing positions, about comrades pinned down or missing. Every second felt like the drumbeat before an inevitable explosion. The first wave of German infantry appeared like shadows in the fog. You could almost hear their boots before they were seen. Hans's squad had been ordered to hold this position at all costs, a phrase that sounded meaningless now as artillery shells exploded behind them, sending clouds of dirt and shattered wood into the air. He peeked through the iron sights of the MG-42, feeling the vibration in his palms as the world narrowed to a tunnel of barrel and target. The moment the enemy came within range, Hans opened fire. The machine gun barked like a wild animal. Bullets shredded the fog, kicked up clouds of soil, and forced the first group of attackers to falter. Behind him, the remnants of his squad had already begun retreating, fear, fatigue, and the realization that the line was breaking, leaving them no choice. And then it happened, a deafening crack. A shell landed just meters away. Hans felt the ground shake under his boots. He stumbled, hearing a sharp pain rip through his shoulder. One of his comrades screamed, then silence. The decision presented itself in the most primal form: run or stay and face almost certain death. Hans's mind raced. 17 years old, too young to die, but running now meant hundreds of others trapped behind him would be left to the merciless advance of armored infantry. You can almost feel the weight pressing down on him, the weight of responsibility no teenager should carry, but Hans didn't hesitate. He stayed. The fog thickened, bullets cutting arcs through the gray morning. Every pull of the trigger was a heartbeat of defiance. Every breath was a testament to his will. Enemy soldiers tried to flank him, screaming orders and firing blindly into the smoke. Hans's hand shook, then steadied. The first casualty of the enemy's charge fell, then another. Hours stretched like days. You could almost hear the desperation in the forest, the cries of men trying to escape, the metallic bite of bullets, the roar of artillery that seemed determined to tear the world apart. And in the middle of it, Hans sat alone, wounded yet unbroken. Each time he fired, he carved seconds, minutes, into existence for the soldiers behind him, giving them a chance to scramble to survive. But time was running out. The MG-42 jammed, a small, terrifying reminder that even the strongest resolve has limits. Hans's fingers, blistered and trembling, worked quickly to clear the weapon, sweat stinging his eyes. The enemy was relentless, pressing harder, testing every angle, probing every weakness. Around him, the forest seemed alive, pulsing with the chaos of war, and every tree became a potential shield or a tombstone. Somewhere in the distance, Hans caught sight of a group of soldiers breaking through the line, their faces a mix of terror and gratitude. Over 300 of them, he realized, had been given a chance to escape because he had refused to abandon his post. And yet, he couldn't let himself think of victory, not yet, not while bullets still sang through the morning air. The gunfire intensified, shouts became screams, smoke and debris mingled, choking the senses. Hans's vision blurred, his shoulders screaming with every movement. And then he heard the unmistakable sound, the crunch of enemy boots coming closer, closer than ever before. And in that heartbeat, that infinite, terrifying moment, Hans realized something that would define him forever. This stand would either be remembered as a miracle, or it would be his last act. The enemy was close now, so close that Hans could make out the glint of bayonets in the early morning light, the sharp angles of helmets, the determination etched into the faces of men trained to kill. Smoke mingled with mist, clinging to his uniform, searing his lungs with every breath. His shoulder throbbed, the wound a constant reminder that he was human, fragile, 17, and yet alone in the eye of the storm. Hans adjusted his position behind the machine gun nest, pressing the cold metal of the MG-42 against his chest as if it were an extension of his own body. Every shot sent vibrations through his arms, each recall an echo of his defiance. He was firing not just bullets, but time itself, seconds that mattered to the soldiers fleeing behind him. Somewhere amidst the chaos, he heard distant explosions, the crack of artillery, and the unrelenting scream of men caught in the crossfire. A squad of enemy soldiers lunged from the fog, moving like shadows between the trees. Hans didn't hesitate. He squeezed the trigger. The machine gun roared. 1, 2, 3, falling into the mud and mist. He could almost hear their collective gasp, the instant where they realized this boy, barely older than a child, had stopped them dead in their tracks. Blood seeped into his uniform, staining the green fabric as his shoulder wound worsened. Pain shot down his arm with every heartbeat, sharp and insistent, but he ignored it. Pain was a luxury, failure was unthinkable. Behind him, soldiers were still crawling to safety, dragging wounded comrades over the rough ground, their faces masks of exhaustion and terror. Each one who survived added a silent weight of responsibility on his shoulders. Time slowed and then sped up in impossible cycles. Minutes felt like hours, every moment stretched taut with the tension of imminent death. Hans's ears rang with the cacophony of battle, the whine of bullets, the cracks of rifles, the distant boom of artillery, and yet he focused, eyes locked on the advancing silhouettes. He fired in controlled bursts, careful to conserve ammunition, to maximize every pull of the trigger. And then came the moment that could have ended everything. A tank rumbled into view, its steel treads crushing the forest floor, shaking the earth beneath Hans's boots. Smoke hissed from its exhaust, and he felt the heat of its engine on his face. He knew that alone, without support, his position could not stop the armored behemoth. Yet he refused to move. Every instinct screamed to run, to hide, to survive, but the thought of the 300 men behind him overrode fear. Hans shifted his aim, targeting the infantry guarding the tank. He had no anti-tank weapons, no reinforcements, just his wits, his machine gun, and the belief that somehow he could hold the line. Bullets tore into the advancing soldiers, forcing them to retreat, giving precious seconds for the men fleeing behind to cover more ground. He was a one-man wall, standing against an unstoppable tide. The forest became a blur of motion and smoke. Hans could feel exhaustion creeping in, his arms heavy, fingers stiff, eyes burning. Every shot was a negotiation with death, every breath a silent prayer. And yet, in that haze of pain and adrenaline, he felt something else. Clarity. This was his moment. If he faltered, hundreds would die. If he stood, some might live. The choice was terrifyingly simple. Hours passed, or maybe it was minutes. Time had lost all meaning. At some point, Hans realized he was alone. His comrades had escaped. The line behind him was empty. He was the only thing standing between the enemy and the scattered remnants of his unit. The enormity of it struck him, 17 years old, wounded, exhausted, and yet the fulcrum upon which life and death teetered. A sudden explosion nearby sent a shockwave through his chest, nearly toppling him. Debris rained down, choking the air, cutting off his vision. Through the smoke, he saw them again, enemy soldiers closing in, relentless, their numbers seemingly infinite. And yet he didn't falter. He fired, each burst precise, each pull of the trigger a refusal to die quietly. Somewhere deep in the chaos, Hans heard the faintest cheer, the sound of men finally making it to safety. Over 300 souls, alive because of him, and still he didn't stop. The war wasn't over and he wasn't done. The forest shook again with the roar of artillery. His shoulders screamed, his arms trembled, and the world around him seemed to collapse and rebuild with every shot. And then, in the midst of this relentless battle, he heard it, a whisper carried on the wind, almost impossible to make out amidst the chaos, a voice calling his name, reinforcements, or the enemy drawing nearer. His heart pounded, every sense screamed danger, every fiber of his being tensed. The next decision would define everything. Would Hans survive this impossible stand, or was the next moment the one that would claim him? The forest had become a nightmare of smoke, mud, and unrelenting noise. Hans's ears were ringing, his vision blurred, yet he could still pick out movement, shadows slipping through the fog, shapes of soldiers advancing in terrifying waves. He was alone, completely, utterly alone. And yet he remained at his post, the MG-42 cradled like a lifeline, his hands shaking but refusing to quit. Every instinct screamed to run, to escape, to survive, but Hans couldn't. He knew the cost of leaving, hundreds of men trapped behind him, their lives tethered to the rhythm of his gunfire. With every pull of the trigger, he could hear them scrambling, hear the faint cries of the wounded being dragged through mud and shattered trees. The realization hit him like a cold slap. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was the line, the shield, the heartbeat of a desperate army. A shell exploded nearby, sending shards of bark and splintered wood flying. Hans tumbled to the ground, rolling instinctively to avoid the worst of it. Pain seared through his side, sharper than before, but he forced himself upright, rolling the MG-42 into position once more. The enemy was close now, too close for comfort. He could make out their faces through the fog, young men barely older than him, eyes hard with training and fear, weapons raised. And then they came, the infantry swarming like water over rocks, relentless, methodical. Hans fired in controlled bursts, the gun roaring like a beast untamed. Each shot found its mark, each pull of the trigger a defiance against the tide. Around him the world was chaos, flashes of muzzle fire, the thump of distant artillery, the cries of men, friend and foe alike, lost in the fog of war. He could feel exhaustion creeping in. Every muscle screamed for rest, every joint ached from the unnatural position he had held for hours. His hands were blistered, his fingers stiff, his shoulder throbbing with every movement. And yet he didn't stop. Not now, not ever. The thought of the soldiers he had saved, the ones still making their escape through the forest, kept him rooted. The enemy realized something too. This post was defended by more than a weapon, it was defended by an unbreakable will. They tried flanking him, moving around the trees, yelling orders, attempting to draw him out. Hans anticipated each move, adjusting his aim, tracking them through the mist. He was a ghost in the smoke, a force that refused to be diminished. Hours stretched endlessly, time became irrelevant. The line behind him had dissolved entirely, but the enemy was contained, stalled by a single boy who refused to yield. Hans could feel every heartbeat, every pull of the trigger, every breath a statement. He would not allow this position to fall. And then came the creeping realization, the ammo was running low. He checked the belt, his eyes widening in silent panic. Only a few rounds left. Every pull of the trigger had been precious, every bullet a lifeline. But Hans didn't falter. He rationed his shots, targeting the closest threats with deadly precision. His training, his instinct, and the raw adrenaline coursing through his veins guided every movement. Somewhere in the chaos, he heard it again, the faint sound of movement behind him, reinforcements, or more enemy closing in from a direction he hadn't anticipated. His heart pounded like a drum, echoing in his ears. He could almost feel the forest itself holding its breath. Hans's body screamed in protest, his vision narrowing to the silhouettes in front of him. Sweat strung his eyes, mixing with blood and mud. The machine gun chattered like a living thing, feeding on his fear and determination. And then, as if the universe itself was testing him, the enemy pressed harder, wave after wave, relentless, like water over stone. In that moment, Hans realized something profound. This stand wasn't just about survival. It was about courage, about the impossible act of holding fast when everything else demanded surrender. 17 years old, wounded, exhausted, yet unbroken. Each bullet, each shot, each second was a testament to a will that refused to die quietly. And then through the smoke and chaos, he saw them, the soldiers he had saved, more than 300 of them now clear of the immediate danger, running towards safety. Relief surged through him, fleeting and fragile, because the fight wasn't over. Not yet. The enemy was still pressing, the forest still burned, and Hans still had to survive. A sharp crack rang out behind him. Something had shifted. He tensed, every nerve on edge. Was it the enemy closing in? Or had the forest itself conspired to trap him in this impossible moment? One thing was certain, the next seconds would define everything. The forest had turned into a battlefield of shadows and smoke. Hans's vision swam with exhaustion, his shoulder now throbbing violently with every movement. Every step he had taken, every pull of the MG-42 trigger had pushed him closer to collapse, but there was no time to collapse. The enemy was relentless, advancing as if driven by the very force of death itself. Hans crouched lower, letting the barrel of his machine gun sweep the approaching soldiers. He could feel each bullet recoil through his hands, each burst a small victory in a war of inches. His body ached, his lungs burned, and yet his mind was razor-sharp, focused entirely on the single truth: stay alive. Every second he held the line was a second gained for the men who had survived because of him. The enemy infantry was coordinated, moving in tighter formations now, attempting to overwhelm his position with sheer numbers. Hans's heart pounded in his chest. Adrenaline surged, masking the pain, pushing him beyond what a 17-year-old should have been capable of. Every instinct, every ounce of training, every shred of courage became his weapon. A nearby explosion threw him sideways, mud and splinters raining over him. His ears rang, his vision clouded by smoke and dust. For a heartbeat, everything went black. And then, through the ringing, he realized the MG-42 was still firing. His fingers, almost without conscious thought, continued to pull the trigger. He was a machine now, a single human instrument of defiance against an entire army. Hours had passed. Time had lost all meaning. Hans barely noticed the pain anymore. His mind was locked on the advancing shadows, the silhouettes of men who could end him in an instant. And yet, every enemy who fell was a small miracle, a fleeting pause in the relentless surge. Then came the sound that nearly broke him, the unmistakable whine of enemy reinforcements. Mori soldiers, tanks, machine guns, everything converging on his position. His heart sank. There was no one left to save. The soldiers behind him were long gone. The forest was silent, save for the approaching storm of death. Hans gritted his teeth and fired anyway. Every shot was precise, controlled, a symphony of chaos that refused to be silenced. He knew the odds were impossible. He knew he might not survive this, but the alternative, failure, was unthinkable. 17 years old, alone, wounded, facing an army, he had become more than a soldier. He had become a legend in real time. A tank rumbled closer, crushing the earth with every rotation of its treads. Hans had no anti-tank weapon. There was nothing he could do to stop it, and yet he didn't flinch. He moved, aimed, fired at the infantry guarding the vehicle, each shot carving a path of temporary survival. Seconds stretched into eternity. The roar of engines, the crack of rifles, the scream of artillery, all merged into one endless, deafening symphony. And then something incredible happened. A distant shout, a rallying cry from Allied reinforcements, cut through the chaos. Smoke, fire, and the distant gunfire of support forces surged into the forest. The enemy faltered, hesitated, unsure if they faced a single boy or the combined might of an army returning to the fight. Hans's muscles screamed in protest. His hands shook violently, his shoulder now a mass of pain, but he didn't stop. Not now, not after everything he had already done. Each remaining round he fired was a final declaration: he would not be defeated. Through the haze of smoke and fear, he saw them, the first wave of reinforcements pushing the enemy back, the men he had saved now turning to join the counterattack. Relief surged in him, but he didn't allow himself to breathe. He was still on the line, the forest still burned, the enemy still pressed. And then finally, the impossible moment arrived, a lull in the assault. The enemy had been stalled, their momentum broken by the actions of a single 17-year-old boy, bleeding and exhausted, who had refused to abandon his post. Hans collapsed to his knees, the MG-42 clattering beside him, body trembling, mind reeling with the realization of what he had just done. The forest was quiet now, only the distant sounds of retreating enemy forces and approaching allies filling the void. Hans sat amidst the destruction, mud-streaked and bloodied, staring at the horizon. 300 lives had been saved because he had refused to quit, because he had stood alone. And in that moment, a truth crystallized in his mind. Courage is not measured by age, strength, or numbers. It is measured by the refusal to surrender when everything else demands it. Hans Meyer had faced an impossible tide, and he had held it back. But even as relief washed over him, a single, terrifying thought lingered. The battle was over, but the war was not. And Hans's story, the story of the boy who became a one-man army, was only just beginning to echo across the front lines. The forest, once alive with gunfire and the screams of battle, was now eerily quiet. Smoke curled from shattered trees, and mud clung to every surface, painting the scene in shades of gray and brown. Hans Mayer, 17, wounded and trembling, sat amidst the wreckage. His uniform was torn, streaked with blood and grime, and the MG-42 lay silent beside him. For the first time, he allowed himself to feel the weight of what had just happened. Around him, the sounds of life slowly returned. Soldiers he had saved emerged from the mist, faces pale with exhaustion, eyes wide with disbelief. Some dropped to their knees, embracing the first comrades they had managed to survive with. And then, word spread, the boy at the machine gun post, the one who had held the line alone, had stopped the enemy long enough for over 300 men to escape. Hans felt a wave of relief, quickly replaced by disbelief. He had only done what he had to do. It hadn't felt heroic in the moment, it had felt like survival. Yet the men he had saved now looked at him with a mixture of awe, gratitude, and something deeper, something almost sacred. To them, he was more than a soldier. He was a guardian, a symbol. Medical officers arrived, dragging him to a makeshift field hospital. His wounds were treated, though not without grim reminders, the pain in his shoulder, the cuts and bruises along his body, and the fatigue that threatened to collapse him at any moment. He barely registered the faces around him, his mind replaying the endless hours at the gun, the soldiers escaping, the enemy advancing. Every memory was vivid, seared into his consciousness. Word of Hans's stand spread quickly through the ranks. Officers spoke of his bravery in hushed tones, while soldiers repeated his story around campfires and in letters home. Newspapers would later call him a boy hero. Though Hans himself rejected the title, he didn't fight for glory, he had fought because there was no other choice. And yet, the world outside the battlefield needed heroes, and he had become one, whether he wanted it or not. Months later, when the war finally drew to a close, Hans Mayer's name appeared in official reports. Decorations were awarded, medals pinned to his chest, and photographs taken. People who had never seen the battlefield in person read the story of a 17-year-old boy who had stopped an entire enemy advance. They marveled, celebrated, and tried to imagine what it must have felt like to stand alone against death itself. But the boy who had lived through it knew the truth. War was not glamorous, heroism was not always celebrated, and survival came at a cost. Hans carried the weight of those hours forever, the sights, the sounds, the faces of men who had fallen, the friends who had escaped, and the enemy who had pressed relentlessly. Years later, when Hans would tell the story to historians or journalists, he often emphasized one thing above all: courage is not the absence of fear, it is the decision to act despite it. In that forest, at 17 years old, wounded and exhausted, Hans had chosen courage. He had chosen to stand when all else demanded retreat, and in doing so, he had saved lives beyond measure. The legacy of that day lived on, not just in medals or headlines, but in the soldiers who survived, in the families who received letters home, in the generations who would hear the story and understand that even the youngest among us can shape history. Hans Mayer's stand became a quiet legend, a reminder that bravery often comes in small packages, in moments where every second counts, and in hearts willing to face fear head-on. And as the sun set over the scarred battlefield, Hans looked out over the forest, now silent except for the gentle rustle of leaves. He understood something profound. Though war had tried to take everything from him, it could not take the truth of that moment, the courage, the defiance, the life he had fought to preserve. That truth would endure far longer than the war itself.